gang, Michelle Griep here. You ready for this adventure? Today I'm going to read chapter 1 of my new release, The House at the End of the Moor. You see that? Huge disclaimer, I am not a voice talent, so good luck with this. Chapter 1, March 1861, Dartmoor Prison, Devon, England. Death prowled the cell block like a dark animal seeking prey, especially the weakest. But Oliver Ward would be hanged if he'd let the beast devour the man in the cell beside him. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. When the next spate of coughing ended, Oliver scooted close to the wall, separating him from Jarney. Listen, when Barrow comes by, lay low. I'll tell him you're not fit for work today. No, I cannot let you, my friend. Jarney's ragged voice leached through the stone blocks. Whenever a fever raged, his French accent grew thicker, and today it was viscous enough to blend the words into a syrupy mess. Boots thumped, keys jangled, cell doors swung open, and Barrow's barks permeated the perpetually damp air. Oliver clamped his mouth shut. Speaking when not spoken to by an officer was asking for a lashing. And half the time, Barrow didn't even need a reason to strike. A second later, the hinges of Oliver's door groaned. Officer Barrow's broad shoulders filled the doorway. His arms were a little too long, his mouth just a bit too wide. And if he had a neck, it was buried beneath a thick scruff of black whiskers. "Out!" Barrow bellowed. "Daylight's a-wastin'." Oliver's gaze climbed the grimy walls, slick with mold and stained to an oily brown by the guilt of men. Near the top, a barred open space let in cold air and light as gray as his evening gruel. Daylight? Hardly. Even so, Oliver shoved to his feet. Tarrying would earn him a crack in the skull. Not that what he was about to do would merit any lesser of a punishment. Chains clanking from the shackles on his wrists, he strode out of his cell and swung into place at the back of the line of other prisoners. As soon as Barrow reached for Jarney's door, Oliver wheeled about. "Officer Barrow, sir. Johnny's ill. I'll take his share of work today." "That's so?" A slow smile slashed across Barrow's face. The hairs at the nape of Oliver's neck stood out like wires. Barrow never smiled. Oliver swallowed against the tightness in his throat. "Yes, sir." The three prisoners behind him turned, the whites of their eyes catching lantern light and flickering with interest. Anything, even something as mundane as a few words to an officer, generated curiosity. Boredom was as real a killer as the pox. "Huh," Barrow grunted, his brows arching to his hairline, which wasn't far off. Crazed locks of bristly black shot out in all directions from beneath the man's hat. "I don't recall asking you about Johnny." Those same brows lowered, drawing into an ominous line. "But now that I know you're capable of doing more, I shall expect it. Oh, and Ward, no talking unless spoken to." Barrow's fist shot out. Knuckles slammed into cartilage, which gave way with a sickening crunch. Oliver's head snapped back. He stumbled, barely catching himself before knocking into the man behind him. Laughter bounced off the walls, mocking without any words. Blood dripped onto his lips. Oliver swiped it away. Then, once again, faced Barrow, undaunted. "For pity's sake, man, you'll get no work out of Johnny today. Let him rest, and he'll live to work tomorrow." Barrow chuckled. "Never learn, do you, Ward? Just can't keep that pretty mouth of yours shut." Oliver raised his fists, ready to parry, but too late. Barrow yanked out his truncheon and whacked away, driving him to his knees as if he were not more than a railroad spike to be pounded into the ground. Blackness closed in. Sound receded, save for the bothersome buzzing and the muffled growl of Barrow ordering Johnny out of the cell. "Breathe, just breathe." Slowly, Oliver's vision crept back. Pain banged around inside his skull, radiating from crown to jaw. Turning aside, he spat out a mouthful of blood, then rose on shaky legs. One day Barrow would pay for his brutality, and Oliver could think of 100 ways he'd like to see that justice carried out. Johnny lurched out of his cell, shoring himself up with a hand on the wall, the chains on his wrists scraping against the rock. His hair hung in strings, hiding half his face. But he stood, thank God. He stood on his own. If he fell, Barrow would show no mercy. Barrow slapped the end of his club against his open palm, the harsh sound making a point. Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor. His dark eyes drilled holes into Oliver and Johnny. Therein shall ye find your salvation. Oliver blinked to keep from rolling his eyes, which would only invite another clout to the head. Officer Barrow, fancying himself as the vicar of Dartmoor Prison, spouting scripture with as much gusto as a stiff eastern wind. He never got it quite right, though. A missing word, an added phrase. His own doctrines coloring God's precepts to a cadaverous shade. On the longest, coldest nights, Oliver often spent the black hours wondering if the man were Eden's snake come in human flesh. Move it! Barrow smacked his club against the wall, the echo urging the 5 of them to turn about and tramp through the bowels of the prison. It was a blessing, this broken nose of his. The stench in his own cell was putrid enough, but the reek in the passageways was worse. This time of day, when prisoners were yanked from their dark holes and hauled outside for manual labor, the opening and closing of the doors stirred all the noisome stinks and collected them into one big, eye-watering vapor trapped in the corridor. It used to gag him. Now it just annoyed. As they mounted the stairs, he whispered over his shoulder, "Grab a hold, Johnny. I'll pull you up." Chains rattled. Fingers dug into his shirt. Hopefully, Barrow wouldn't notice Johnny's grip on his shoulders. The stairway opened into a large hall, a hub of activity. Convicts of worse crimes than his shuffled about in leg irons. Those who'd committed lesser offenses wore nothing but the wrinkled clothing they'd arrived in. But all had been issued shoes with nails pounded into the soles in the shape of an arrow, a dead giveaway should someone be reckless enough to escape, leaving a trail so obvious a blind bishop could follow. Oh, they were easy enough to take off, but running barefoot in the wild could mean death. If not from the nip of an adder, then from the bite of rocks and gorse on the moorland, which could cut through the toughest of flesh or callus. And nothing but miles upon miles of moor surrounded the prison. Oliver trudged along. Around him, guards prodded prisoners, some destined for meaningful work, such as oakum picking, but most were headed for rock breaking. Only God and Barrow knew how Oliver and his cohorts would spend the long hours of this day. Personally, he hoped for oakum. It was hand-shredding work, but at least it served a purpose. Before they turned down the passageway, a crab-like man, ruddy-skinned and hunchbacked, scuttled sideways over to them. One of his legs was shorter than the other, giving him an offbeat gait. It was a wonder Officer Wimpole was yet on the payroll. "Hold up there, Mr. Barrow!" As much as Oliver, and no doubt the rest of them, wanted to turn around and watch the exchange, to do so would mean added time to their service. And time was oft more brutal than the actual work. Oliver strained to hear. A belch of damnation spewed out of Barrow, then he stomped to the front of their line and faced them. "Sorry, girls, there's another matter to which I must attend post-haste. Officer Wimpole and Mr. Piggins will oversee you today." He aimed his index finger at the prisoners like the muzzle of a gun. "And if I hear that any one of you give either of my colleagues so much as a crossed eye, I'll send you to your maker. Understood?" "Yes, sir," they shouted in unison. Barrow stalked off. Wimpole took his place, making sure to handle the revolver at his side. He was an arthritic old coot, but no less deadly with that firearm loaded and ready to go. "Outside," he tipped his head towards the front door. "The lot of ye. Piggins has a wagon ready." So, no oakum or rock breaking then, and best of all, no Barrow. Oliver resisted the urge to make eye contact with Johnny, though the man had to be thinking what he was. Any little twitch might give him away, might give them away, and this was too momentous an occasion for error. This might be it, though. The day, the show, the single moment Oliver had been counting on since he'd arrived in this hellhole. Escape. Wimpole pivoted and led the way. Mistake 1. No guard should turn his back on his prisoners. Oliver flattened his lips to keep from smiling. Outside, a cold blast of air drove misty rain sideways, cooling the hot throbbing of his nose. He hoisted Johnny into the back of the wagon while eyeing the big blob on the driver's bench, reins gripped in hands the size of mutton roasts. Mistake 2. Piggins was as dull-witted as Wimpole was arthritic. The warden never should have paired them up. Surely this was a sign from God. Oliver climbed into the wagon bed and sat beside Johnny, opposite the other 3 prisoners from their corridor. Snooks, Badger, and Flame ignored them, ignored each other, ignored anything other than the sound of their own breathing. It was safer that way. Oliver had learned early on that self-containment could save your life, though he broke that rule for Johnny, a man as unrighteously accused as himself. As soon as Wimpole pulled himself up and hunkered next to Piggins, the wagon rattled forward, and they left behind the gray hulk of Dartmoor Prison. Not that the surrounding countryside was any less forbidding. Unforgiving moorland stretched farther than the eye could see, desolate, dangerous. Whoever thought to put a prison in the middle of this godforsaken terrain was a genius. As they bounced along, Oliver leaned towards Johnny. "Today's the day," he whispered. "Oui, for you." He narrowed his eyes. Was Johnny having second thoughts? "For us," he encouraged. The wheels hit a rock, jostling them all. Oliver shored up Johnny with a grip to his arm. His friend faced him, his skin as colorless as the pewter sky. "I will slow you down. I am not worth your getting caught." Oliver slipped a glance at the men. None looked their way. Not that they would have understood Johnny's accented words or heard his own above the rumble of the cart, but even so, Oliver lowered his voice to barely a whisper. "Don't be ridiculous. Every soul has value." "Even Barrow's?" He sucked in a breath. That stung. Of course Barrow was one of God's creatures, but so was a rat. The wagon rattled onward and didn't stop until Wimpole shouted, "Ho!" They halted near a breach in a sheep fence on the farthest reach of the prison grounds, where Wimpole turned to Piggins. "I'll take this one. Next break is bigger, near half-mile on. You'll see it. Swing back this way when you're done, eh?" Piggins' big head bobbed, and Wimpole lowered himself to the ground, a hammer in hand. "Ward, Johnny, out!" Oliver gripped the wagon's backside and hauled himself over, chains clanking, then offered up a steadying grip as Johnny descended. His friend swayed when his feet hit the uneven turf. Oliver anchored him with a hand to his shoulder. Wimpole threw the hammer at their feet. "Have at it, boys!" Then he hunkered next to where the wall was yet whole, gun in lap, protected from wind and rain. Mistake number 3. Oliver hid a grin. He retrieved the hammer and nodded for Johnny to follow him to the other side of the fence. A nearby cluster of sheep complained at their presence. Good. Their bleating noise, combined with the occasional swoosh of wind off the moorland, would cover up a whispered conversation. He turned to his friend. "This is it. You fetch the rocks. I'll pound them, taking care to break my shackles as well. Then we'll switch places and you—" "No!" Sorrow etched lines in the grime on Johnny's brow. "I cannot make it. I will only slow you down. Once you are free of your chains, I will distract Wimpole and you run." "I'm not going without you. You deserve justice every bit as much as I." "And God will see to it, my friend." He gripped Oliver's arm in a weak hold. "Never lose hope." "But we can do this. We can." The hammer of a gun ratcheted. So did Wimpole's voice, both overriding the noisy sheep. "Quit your jawing and get to work." "Yes, sir," he and Johnny shouted and turned. Sweet mercy. Wimpole stood on the other side of the breach, 3 paces away. How had he drawn so near without a sound? Then again, it made sense. The deadening whoosh of the wind and the baa-baing of sheep could just as well work against them as for them. Johnny advanced a step, stumbling, as the next gust nearly took him down. "Permission to haul rocks, sir." Wimpole lowered his gun and flipped up his collar against the rain, a growl rumbling in his throat. "Reuse what's fallen." Oliver gained Johnny's side, mind whirring. If they weren't allowed to range farther into the moor, he'd have to come up with a different plan of escape, And Lord, but he did not want to use violence. He motioned towards the ground. Look for yourself, sir. The rocks here are nothing but crumbles. We use those, and we'll be back out here next month, guaranteed. Plus, it'll take twice as long since we'll have to... All right, all right. Wimple turned aside and spat. Just get it done. But only one of you retrieving at a time, understood? Yes, sir. Apparently satisfied, Wimple shambled back to his post against the wall. Jarney plodded off, shoulders wilting. From relief or from his fever? Oliver lifted his face to the rain, letting the fine spray wash away the blood left from Barrow's fat fist. Oh, God, grant Jarney strength enough to leave this place behind, or grant me the power to carry him. Stanchioned by faith alone, he set to work. Jarney hauled him a rock. He broke off the edges to fit snug against those on the wall, taking care to strike the iron hasp on his shackles every other swing. By the fifth stone, he'd added a layer to the fence and cracked the cuff pin on his right wrist. 4 more rocks, and the other was nearly freed. But each successive trip cost Jarney more than the man could pay. Sweat dripped from his brow. Heat radiated off of him in waves. His eyes sank deeper into the sockets, and blue rimmed his lips. This had to stop. When Jarney handed him another rock, Oliver leaned in close. We'll switch places after the next one. Then you free yourself. I'll take on Wimple, and we'll run. Jarney nodded. Or did he? Hard to tell when his friend shook so much from cold and exhaustion. You are a good friend, Ward, truly, but I cannot make it. You know I cannot. But if we... No. Jarney's voice rang out, surprisingly sharp. Oliver tensed. That one little error could bring their wild attempt crashing down upon their heads. They both glanced in Wimple's direction. The man sat like a lump of coal, hat brim pulled down, shoulders hunched. Had he dozed off? Oliver unlocked his clenched jaw. Jarney, listen to me. No, you listen. His friend's gray eyes burned into his. Promise me you will run, fast and far, clear your name, then come back for me. Oliver shook his head. I cannot leave you. I will not. It isn't right. Yet it is the only way. Years and tears and lines carved deep into Jarney's face. You'll not get another chance like this, and you know it. A sigh ripped out of him. Blast! Was nothing ever right or good on this side of heaven? Get your lazy backsides to work! Wimpo growled, his head rising, just enough to skewer them with a cancerous gaze. And that was it. No more time to argue, to plan, to think. Oliver gripped Jarney's arm. I'll come back for you. I vow it. A sad smile lifted half of his friend's blue lips. Of course you will. Godspeed. Then he turned and staggered off. Oliver's throat ached as he watched his friend pick his way over the mounded scrub, clutching his belly with one arm. How wicked the ways of men, when the poor must suffer while the rich wallowed in their wealth. He ought to know. He'd seen both sides. White-hot fury rose up from his gut, choking him, and he swung the hammer hard. The wearied metal cracked, and the shackle broke free. Stop! He froze. Heaven help him. Wimpole had seen. But no, the guard shot to his feet and leveled his gun at the scarecrow shape, edging across the desolate landscape. That's far enough, Johnny. Get back here. Johnny didn't so much as glance over his shoulder. He lumbered on, stumbling ahead, until the mist draped his form like a burial shroud, and he disappeared. Wimpole heaved out a string of curses, then slip ran in a cockeyed gait after Johnny. Godspeed, indeed. Oliver yanked the bonds off his wrists, gouging flesh and not caring, then threw the chains to the ground. A minute later, his shoes lay beside them. Though he hated to take the time to do so, he ripped off the bottom half of his shirt and hastily tied the shreds around his feet. Then he picked up the hammer and took off at a dead run. He followed the wagon trail. Ahead, the wall curved. He'd cut right, then tear onto the moor, and a gunshot boomed. Flaming pain cut into his arm, and his step hitched. But he couldn't stop now, not ever. Sooner than he liked, he veered off into the rugged wasteland, a single burning prayer pumping hard with each heartbeat. God have mercy, God have mercy. Hopefully he would. For it would only be a matter of time before Piggins and the dogs were set loose after him. Or worse, Constable Barrow. And then there'd be no mercy. That's chapter 1. You want to find out what happens? Does he get away? Does Barrow chase him? Do the dogs get after him? Or what? You'll have to get the house at the end of the moor to find out if he is successful at his escape and in clearing his name, and what happens to Journey, and all the above. So lovely to read with you today. Again, my apologies for my lame-o accents and not particularly great diction. So I'm a writer, not a reader, thankfully. All right, happy day, guys. Bye.